Welcome to Scientists Unedited. I'm your host Eirini, and with this podcast, I aim to bring you the stories behind the individuals. We will be focusing on the lives of the scientists of cell and gene therapy alongside their discoveries. In this first episode, we will hear the story of Professor Porteus, the incoming ASGCT President, who was raised in the Stanford ghetto, ended up being a skiing instructor after being burnt out at Harvard, and eventually returned back to Stanford and California to become a doctor informed by his own family's interactions with the healthcare system. But before we get started, ASGCT is hosting a one-day graduate medical education bootcamp in cell and gene therapy, which is perfect for clinical fellows, residents, advanced practice providers, junior faculty, and early career investigators. Learn how to safely and effectively integrate cell and gene therapies into patient care. Join us on August 21st at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. Visit asgct.org to learn more. Hi, Matt. Welcome. Welcome to our new podcast.
Thank you, Eirini.
It felt very fitting, new ASGCT president, new podcast, so it only makes sense. With this podcast, we will try to tell the stories of scientists that have been contributing to the cell and gene therapy space.
Yeah.
And the aim here is really to take people through your story. And that's why we're going to start from the very beginning.
Okay.
And I now know you for a while, so I know that it all starts in Stanford. It ends in Stanford, but we're going to go through the beginning.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about the Stanford ghetto and the childhood there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, congratulations on starting the podcast. You'll have a chance to talk with many more interesting people than me, but given that I'm the incoming president, I understand. So yeah, as you said, I grew up on the Stanford campus. My father is a retired business school professor, and Stanford owns a lot of land, and on that land they build housing, and so the only to be eligible to live in the housing, you have to be Stanford faculty. So I grew up in a neighborhood that was surrounded by Stanford faculty and professors, so we affectionately called it the Stanford ghetto because we were all sort of the same.
And it's funny to me that you say your life is not interesting, but you have to understand that for people all over the world, I assume, life in the, both Stanford, the Silicon Valley, these are like mystical places.
Yeah.
So please tell us a bit more about what were you perceiving as normal life back then? Because that is not normal life to us, but it was for you, I assume.
It was a normal life, but it was a really safe environment. Woke up in the morning, ate breakfast, walked to school, or rode our bike to school. Then there was no threats, no danger. Going to school was just, and doing well in school was just part of the culture, because again, we're surrounded by my parents and my parents' friends, and we're all in the Stanford academic culture. So education and knowledge and debate and is just part of who we were. And doing well in school, no one really talked about it. It was just sort of like, that's what you do, and then you come home and you play with your friends and play soccer and tennis, and you just
But who were your friends? Because if everyone was the kid of a known Stanford professor or a multimillionaire of the Silicon Valley, do you have any famous?
Well, so then so our high school, I went to public high school, but it was full of people who came from kids from the Stanford ghetto. So again, it was public, but it was not. It was very high end. And like in my biology class, my good friend Dan Stryer, his dad is Lubert Stryer, and so the famous Stryer biochemistry textbook. But no one thought much about it. It was like, oh yeah, his dad writes that book, whatever. And
I have nightmares from that book.
Yeah, and lots of other people, and some of whom I didn't even realize how their impact on science until much later. Like we've all heard about the Hayflick limit, which is, a limit on how many times a cell can divide. Well, Rachel Hayflick was a class below me, and so I just knew her as Rachel Hayflick, and I had no idea what her dad had actually contributed. So
and at that age, parents are not that cool, I guess.
No, they're just parents,
And what was a normal conversation like at dinner?
Yeah, it's dinner table conversation, in retrospect, was pretty amazing because, first of all, I'm the oldest. I have a younger sister, younger brother, and my parents. And we sat down for dinner around a round table every night. 6 o'clock, you were not late. And conversation was about everything going on in the world, and you weren't expected to participate, but the conversation was about income inequality and statistics and p-values and
p-values at the dinner table.
I know, it's crazy, and it was also about how the day went, but it was an active conversation. It was an active conversation too about how one should live. Like, what does it mean to we didn't talk about this is what you need to do to be a good person. It was just built in that this is what you wanted to live life well.
So you're being raised in a very intellectually stimulating environment, and I presume that going to college was the default. Doesn't sound like there would have been a debate around that. No, other types of debates, but not this one. But as I understand, and maybe you can tell us a bit more about also your mom's studies. But neither of them were in biology. So how did you decide to go down that route?
Yeah. So. And again, an example of how it was a very intellectual environment. When I was in elementary school, so grades 1 through 6, I'd wake up and there's my mom on the dining room table with all her papers out as she's getting her PhD at the School of Education at Stanford. Like,
how amazing.
And so we'll get to it later, but when I got my PhD, my uncle had a PhD in physics, my dad had a PhD in math, and my mom has a PhD in education. So
you covered all the departments.
I was not a first generation student. Let's just put it that way. So yeah, they as I said, my dad was a numbers person, and it was great to talk that. But I think medicine and biology really just came from my friends' parents and watching shows like Nova and just being intrigued by biology. I don't think there was anything, it wasn't from my family, but it was from just
the surroundings.
The surrounding, yeah.
Okay.
So while my parents weren't involved in medicine or science, my sister has a rare genetic disease that causes extra bone growth. And so she, growing up, would every couple years would have major orthopedic surgeries and would be in the hospital for weeks and recovering for months and being casts. Obviously that had an impact, but I don't think I thought to myself, because Kim has this disease, I want to go into medicine and genetics and gene therapy because of her. Never. But it must have affected me somehow.
Yeah, a lot of things are also subconscious because, I think I've told you that before. My mom had several severe autoimmune disorders and then had cancer when I was 15.
Yeah.
And it just almost felt similar to you. I don't think I ever thought I need to go and study cancer or autoimmune disorders. But when you're being raised in that environment and that is, someone who you adore and you live with, it has to probably play a role subconsciously.
Yeah. And certainly, I don't see patients anymore, but when I saw patients, I learned a lot by listening to my mom, and particularly when she would come home and say, this was today my conversation with the doctors went well. I learned what I wanted to learn. They weren't. And then other days she'd come back and say, they didn't answer my questions, or they came in for 30 seconds and left, and I wondered about this. So I think I learned a lot about
maybe what do patients or the families of
that
patients
other side
expect?
Of things.
Yeah.
And so, I hope that made me a better doctor because I understood. I had been on the other side, not as a patient and not as a parent, but as a sibling, and hearing that side of things and the frustrations people would have when they felt like they weren't getting their questions answered or somebody wasn't paying attention to them or whatnot.
Yeah.
I think I learned from that or I just trust that parents, because I went into pediatrics, actually know and hear, and kids know and hear a lot more than doctors sometimes think they do.
Oh.
That actually they are picking up on everything, and doctors may think they're talking about a concept that is complicated, but this is their life. They learn about it. They know about it. And particularly nowadays with Google and AI and Claude and ChatGPT, everyone can look up everything. And so I think one of the challenges in medicine, again, a little side conversation, is how do you bring people back to reality, because you can go down these rabbit holes now on the internet.
Yeah, a lot of access to information and from random websites. And
it can take you to some dark places, and it can take you to some very misleading places. So I think that's one of the real challenges in medicine right now. And I even see that actually in genetics. I as I said, I came from PhDs, and my brother now has an MBA, and my sister has a PhD. So I come from a smart family, but I still have to explain to them that genetics isn't determinative.
I see.
If it's genetics, for me, is probabilistic. It gives you a probability of having certain characteristics and features and has certain health, but it's not, for the most part, not deterministic. Obviously, we're at the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapy, where there are monogenic diseases, but most people, their genetics is just giving a range of possibilities.
And we will get back to that with misconceptions about science.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. But to come back to the story, effectively, this experience with your sister seems to have informed you of the type of doctor, at least, you wanted to be.
That's correct.
And to study, you went to Harvard. So let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I grew up on the Stanford campus, and a lot of my friends went to Stanford, which is great. And I probably know more people who went to Stanford than went to Harvard, even though I went to Harvard, because so many of my friends went there. But I also I did want to get out of the Stanford bubble. And so in retrospect, I don't know why I picked Harvard over any of the other Ivy League schools. I guess because my mom had grown up in Boston, and maybe it just was Harvard. So, but when I got there, I felt very well prepared academically for the classwork, and my writing needs some improvement, but we all have our strengths and weaknesses. But about half of my classmates had gone to prep schools, and so they had already lived in dorms, and also I was socially way behind because I went to a public high school in California, and the California culture and the public high school culture compared to these people who, to me, were sophisticated beyond, because this is the life they had lived for years. So I always felt out of place. Like I was the naive California person. I was the naive California person. So
I don't know, there's got to be something about Harvard and the East Coast, because every person I've met that went to Harvard, it felt that in the beginning no one seemed to have a sense of belonging. It got better later on, but I just find it fascinating that you would feel like that.
Yeah, I felt like that, and I always felt like that. But then from Harvard, I got a little burnt out, so I actually took a year off. And it was at a time where you could take a year off. Like now, if you take a year off, you have to go work in a lab, or you have to go prove that you're doing something productive. My year off was I went and taught skiing in Colorado, so I became a better skier. And then the summer before, and during that year, I was interviewing for medical school. So I fly from
okay.
the ski area, go to my interviews, and the interviewers who said, "Oh, I wish I had done that. That's great." Those are the schools I got into. And the interviewers who looked at me like, "Are you really serious? You know, you're just
And we can all tell what school did what. Or,
yeah. Those are the schools I didn't get into. So luckily, Stanford Medical School. That my interviewer there, like, well, he knew I grew up on sort of, So I got in there, and so I ended up.
So you kind of returned back home, like.
Yeah, and then that felt immediately like home. So as much as I felt out of place at Harvard, back at Stanford, it's like, oh, this is my environment. This is my home.
And being a good skier, living in California, I bet also counts for something.
Yeah, there's
still
something
cannot
there.
ski, but
Yeah.
maybe one day.
Yeah.
So you're now back to Stanford, and at that point, you're going to medical school.
Yeah.
Are you starting to do any research? Do you have any scientific problems that?
So I had done a little bit of research in the summers, but not, and I enjoyed it, but not enough to think that applying. I sort of didn't even really know about MD, PhD programs. I just was in the standard Stanford MD program, but Stanford is one of the few medical schools where they encourage all the medical students to get involved in research. And they, not only is there a culture to do research, but they kind of pay you to do it. So you can reduce your debt and all that. So I started working in a lab as sort of that, as part of that process.
Okay.
And it quickly was obvious to me, and I guess to my PI, that was another really fun place to be. I love designing experiments and doing the experiments and interpreting the experiments. And I remember one evening, most everyone had left, and my PI, walked by the lab and saw me, and he sat down and we were chatting. Roland was his name. And he looks over at me and goes, "Matt, I think you should probably apply to the MD PhD program." And I looked over and I go, "Yeah, I think that's probably the right thing to do." Because I just enjoyed the process of science, and the discovery and using your, trying to figure things out.
But you're someone who's been interested in developing different tools for diseases and...
Well, so in my PhD, I ended up working with a postdoc who then became a faculty member at UCSF. And his idea was, to develop a new technique to help understand what genes are expressed in the developing forebrain compared to the adult brain, as a way of maybe understanding how brain development works. This is long before microarrays and all this. So I think I learned from him that you can develop a tool to help you understand biology, and I think that sunk in. I also realized that neuroscience and the things that are most interesting about the brain to me are also things that don't lend themselves to molecular biology. So you do 2 years of classes in med school, then I did 3 years of research, and then you go back and do your clinical rotations in med school. And so I had this really strong background in molecular biology and genetics and some development, neurodevelopment. And then in my internal medicine clerkship, I met my first patient who had sickle cell disease. And of course, we have learned about the genetics and the biology. It's a disease that has really been at the forefront of our understanding of a whole host of things. And yet this young woman was coming in pain, and it turns out she had severe sickle cell disease and was in pain a lot. And all we offered to her was time, hydration, and opiates to control her pain, and we just waited for it to get better. And it was sort of at that point, it's like, we know so much about the genetics, we know the mutation that causes this disease. I know in the lab I can fix mutations like that. So what I want to do is I want to take what we can do in the lab and develop a therapy that would address sickle cell disease, and I've been stuck on that ever since.
But you're also someone who's been actively involved with several companies.
Yeah.
Is that an experience that I guess made you want to try entrepreneurship more, or was that a different route?
Well, so for, I would say, the first decade of my academic lab, I had engaged with one or two biotech companies, Sangamo Biosciences, because they were the best company at making zinc finger nucleases and zinc finger proteins. But I never really thought about it too much. And then, so I was working hard on genome editing. There were a handful of us doing it using ZFNs and talons. And at this meeting, there would have been a cohort of about 50 of us, maybe even smaller. Now it's thousands do genome editing here. Yeah. And then when CRISPR was, discovered by Emmanuel and Jennifer, and then quickly shown to work in cells by George Church's lab and Feng Zhang's lab, using systems I had pioneered during my postdoc, correcting GFP in a cell, in 293 T cells. I guess the field was ripe, and so all of a sudden, a bunch of venture capital firms came to my door wanting to learn about genome editing, and it's like, okay, I'll talk to you. This is fun.
It must be great if they come to you instead of trying to raise money.
Again, there was very few people.
Yeah.
And so, there were only a handful of us who had a track record in genome editing. So they wanted to learn more. And as I talked to them, eventually Versant Ventures, who wanted to license the Emmanuel Charpentier aspect of the IP, said, we'd like to engage you as a consultant formally. I was like, that sounds great. And then as we worked more, they realized, no, we want you actually not to be a consultant. We want you to be a scientific founder. And because I was helping them think through that actually sickle cell disease and beta thalassemia were ideal first targets for CRISPR-based, because you could take the cells out. We knew now CRISPR could define changes and then give them back. And it was a big enough disease, there was a large unmet medical need. And so ultimately they seized on that and said, thank you, Matt, we're on our way. and Casgevy has resulted. And so that gave me a sense of what a biotech could do. Like it wasn't writing a grant for, a couple $100,000. It was bringing, hundreds of people to bear on taking something from the lab and getting it into clinic and then getting it from the first patients into a commercially approved product. And so what I learned and have since is realized that biotechs play an essential role in that process. And that's why I now stay engaged with, consulting for biotechs or even spinning out my own companies, because there's only so far you can go in academia, and then you need to take advantage of biotechs. And the work I was doing doesn't naturally first go to a pharmaceutical company. It's still a little too new. So it plays a really important role in the ecosystem.
So let's talk a bit about the future of CRISPR and gene editing. We currently have one approved product, and then there is a recent phase 3 readout from an in vivo technology. But how do you see the future of genomic medicines?
I think we should keep our minds open to a broad and growing toolbox. And I think there are certain diseases for which delivering a gene editing tool, whether it's a Cas9 nuclease to make a inactivated gene, whether it's a base editor, whether it's a prime editor, whether it's something else, delivering that to a tissue in the body might make the most sense. On the other hand, I think that what we now call in vivo, or people call in vivo, but I also believe that cellular therapies are also an important type of drug. And so the editing won't be done by delivering the editor directly to the person, but instead you'll take the cells out, just like Casgevy does, take the cells out, do your sophisticated manipulation, and then give the cells as a drug. So it's a cellular therapy. So I like to think not so much as in vivo and ex vivo, but think about cellular drugs and genetic drugs. And there are biologic properties of cells that are amazing. The hematopoietic stem cell lives the entirety of your life. It makes all your blood cells for life. You make 200 billion red blood cells today. It's an incredible cell. And we've been able to transplant these for 50 years. So I don't see it as either or. I see it as sometimes you're going to want to use this hammer, and sometimes you're going to want to use that screwdriver. And asking the hammer to do what the screwdriver does and vice versa will get in trouble. But if you use the screwdriver for screwing in a screw and use the hammer for hammering in a nail, that's perfect.
But there is something to be said about the low uptake and the challenges with commercialization, and I think that's why maybe now there's just more people working towards the in vivo technologies.
Yeah.
At the same time, they have challenges where in the beginning, and there is all the immunogenicity and...
I think that's right. And I think the slower uptake, but I did predict it, that the sickles, the Casgevy and Lyfgenia uptake was going to steadily ramp up, but it's not, these are not drugs where you make literally a ton of your powder at once and then you distribute it. Every therapy is personalized. You're using their own cells. So it's going to take a little while to ramp up the capacity to make individualized drugs. And we're doing it now in CAR T, right? It took a while, and now we're making, I think 6,000 to 10,000 CAR T products a year. We're going to get to 50,000. We're going to get there. And, this conference is exciting because what you see is people recognizing that we should, maybe we can make CAR Ts in vivo, and maybe sometimes that's going to work, but we're also recognizing that we can build devices that instead of having 10 people make one product or 100 people make one product, we can have one person supervising an industrial manufacturing process that makes 100 products. And that's an engineering problem.
Yeah, moving towards automation.
We're really good engineers as human beings, right? Think about, we make 1 billion phones a year. We make 80 million automobiles a year. We can build stuff. We just need to have that engineering ingenuity be applied to the cell and gene therapy space. One other comment I'll also say is that gene editing, gene therapy, AAV gene therapy, lentiviral gene therapy, gene editing, the first diseases are these rare genetic diseases. But we also know that, in rare genetic diseases, particularly for a one-time therapy, it's hard to create a market. But I think when this field is going to explode even more is when we can develop one-time therapies for more common diseases. And I think that's what's the sort of principle of Verve Therapeutics. We're going to lower cholesterol with a one-time gene editing product to the liver. And so as we understand and develop these various cell and gene therapies for rare diseases, eventually someone's going to crack the nut, and it's going to be for a common disease. And now we're going to have this entirely new class of drugs, where you get it once, instead of once a day or once every 2 weeks or once every 3 months, you get it once.
So as we're getting towards the end of this discussion, I wanted to change gears a bit, and actually you did talk a bit about how doctors think that the younger kids don't understand, and I wanted, and actually how that informed you of the type of doctor that you want to become. The question I wanted to ask you is, what do you think the public gets wrong about the life of a scientist or being a scientist?
For me, the most fun thing about being a doctor and a scientist is not about knowing a lot of facts. You have to know, you have to have some knowledge. There's a great saying, and I finally learned where it came from, is that the eye doesn't see what the mind doesn't know. So if you don't know something exists, it can be right in front of your face and you won't recognize it. So yes, you have to have a body of knowledge. That's key. But that's not what's fun about being a doctor and a scientist. What's fun about being a doctor and a scientist is the problem solving, the process of figuring things out. I understand this much, but I need to understand more. How am I going to do that? And so that process of discovery is really what's great about science. And that's what science is. It's not body of knowledge. It's a process of discovery and understanding the world and trying to make the best sense of the world for science and trying to discover the best treatment for a patient.
I will need to play this to my parents, that every time they hear about a disease or like one of our relatives not doing well, they come to me like I'm a moving encyclopedia. And I think I disappoint them very frequently by saying that I don't know. And actually it's interesting about what you said. It really made me think about the pandemic years. I experienced part of it in the UK, part of it in Greece, and part of it in the US.
Well, that's,
nice. But I did see like a common thread because of that misunderstanding. I think the public was kind of lost trust because they thought that we would know everything, and when they saw, like a change in guidance or advice, they lost trust. And I do think it's stemming from the fact that they believe we know everything, whereas the reality of a scientist is constantly trying to understand and, changing the information, changing the hypotheses based on new information. So
I agree. And I think people were making the best decisions and providing the best guidance for the knowledge we had at the time, but we didn't convey that idea that this is a new virus. It's similar to some old viruses.
It's all evolving.
It's all evolving, and I think we could have done a better job saying, okay, this is what we understand, and trusting the public to learn along with us instead of the public assuming the public just wants to be told what to do. I think we would have done better if we had taken an approach. And again, Tony Fauci had an impossible job, so I would never have wanted his job. But he's done an amazing. But I think if he had taken more of an approach of travel the journey with us, and here's how we're thinking about what we know, I think we might have created more public trust, or there wouldn't have been that dichotomy. There would have been more trust around. I mean, the uptake of the vaccine was pretty darn good in the U.S., but it also created a movement that we're still suffering from.
Lots of skepticism. So, after this discussion, what would you hope that people can take from your story?
That you should follow what interests you. I mean, people say follow your passion. Yeah, that's great. But I think what interests you today, and ideally, if you're in a position, can you take on a project that might not have a reward in, and that's the other thing about science, is that, and a difference between science and medicine. Often in medicine, you can make somebody better within a few hours or a few days. In science, you have to have that patience to allow discovery to unfold over days, weeks, years, decades. And hopefully you've had this experience. I mean, I still remember, half a dozen times where I looked at a result and I knew I was the first person in the world to see this, and, I knew what it meant. And it was like super thrilling. Then that followed by weeks, months, and years of getting to the next step. And so you have to have that patience, but you also have that impatience that I need to be making little steps every day. So follow that. Find the things that you will want to do every day, even when you have bad days. We all have our bad days, but it still interests you and it's passionate. But it also takes you on a trajectory where in 10 years you can look back and go, oh, it didn't feel like it at the time, but we've gotten from here to here.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I think related to doing what you like each day, it's nice to get accolades. Like, I was honored to be elected president of ASGCT, but for me that endorphin rush only lasts for a few seconds. You get a manuscript accepted and it lasts for a few seconds. So you need to also just have comfort in who you are and not be driven by those bursts of endorphins from an accolade.
As you said, you are who you are.
You are who you are. Yeah.
So with that, I really wanted to thank you for joining us today. but also for thanking me, take this podcast further. You helped me in the beginning when I started thinking about it. So I hope you bring me luck.
Well, I think this is an exciting podcast. And when you talked to me about this idea, I think about a year ago, I thought it was great, and I'm really glad you're off the ground. I'm really glad ASGCT is providing this forum, because I think the concept that science is done by people and introducing the world or even other scientists to the people who are doing it is going to be a great thing. So look forward to seeing all the interesting people you talk to.
Me too. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.